Well, there are a number of ways in which to characterize philosophy. None of them is definitive, but I think all of them help. One way I think of philosophy is that it's a way in which we intellectually continue to be like children. There's something childish, or at least childlike, about the sorts of questions that philosophers ask. They're always asking why. They're asking what does it mean. They're asking why should I be good. They're asking what does it mean to say it means something. And these are sort of characteristically babyish questions on which philosophers take a lot of, put a lot of effort and take a lot of time. So another way of thinking about philosophy is as the sort of questions for which there is no generally agreed method for their resolution. So, for example, we could understand the question, what does it look like on the other side of the moon, long before we were able to look on the other side of the moon, because we could all agree that if we could get a rocket back there and take a look, that would answer the question. But with philosophical questions, the dispute is nearly always in part about what would be the right way to approach the question. And that is one way in which philosophy specifically differs from science. And indeed, when we do arrive at a consensus about how to answer a certain kind of question, then that question becomes a scientific question. It becomes, for example, a question that is part of physics, or it becomes a question that is part of psychology. And in this way, various sciences have, as it were, just branched off from the trunk of philosophy. They used to be called philosophical questions, and they're now in the realm of scientific questions because there is a broad consensus among scientists about how we should approach the question of how to answer them. So philosophy also has some interesting resemblances and differences with, say, religion. Because like religion and unlike science, it's especially interested in looking at the broadest possible questions, the most general questions about the universe, about life, about time, about what kind of things we human beings are. But unlike religion, we aspire to answer them in a way that is more like science by means, at least in part, of rigorous argument. And unlike religion, we don't have a book that tells us all the answers ahead of time. And so, like science, philosophy is essentially fallible. It admits that it can be wrong, though it also must be admitted that most philosophers don't admit that they can be wrong, but they admit that the field as a whole can be wrong. So that's, if you like, a point in common and a difference with science. Now, I think with literature and art, the connection is also interesting because unlike literature, where you hope to get something in a very general way about what it is to be human, what life is like, and so on, you don't need, if you're a poet or a novelist or a painter, you don't need to say only things that are true. But a philosopher aims to illuminate human nature by saying things that are actually true. And by giving arguments, which if they figure in a work of literature, of course, are just part of the plot or they're just part of somebody's character. But if an argument appears in a movie or in a novel, you don't necessarily have to attend to the question of whether that's a good argument or a bad argument, because that's not really what it's about. But in philosophy, that is what it's about. So there's another way in which I think of philosophy, which is sort of on the model of the way in which when you see a certain picture, you might be led to look at it in a completely different way by being given a caption. So my favorite example of this is a fairly well-known doodle, which consists of simply a circle with two lines sticking out of it. And you say to people, what is that? And the answer is, of course, they don't know. They say, well, it's an olive with a toothpick in it, or one thing or another. And the answer is, it's a person in a Mexican hat riding a bicycle seen from on top. Now, when you see that, you immediately, people laugh. They have this sort of ha-ha experience because they're having an aha experience. They're thinking, ah, yes, I see it. Yes, I do see it that way. And you didn't see it before you got the caption, but now you see it. And I think at its best, philosophy actually makes us see the world and what it is to be human in a different way. That, I think, is the highest ambition of philosophy. And it's because of that that philosophy, I think, retains or should retain its ambition to change our lives or to make our lives better. Well, there have been people who have suggested that perhaps we should, instead of giving entrance examination to graduate study in philosophy, we should give people a series of philosophical jokes and perhaps non-philosophical jokes. And if they laugh at the philosophical jokes, then that shows that they have the right disposition to do philosophy. So that is something that philosophy has in common with humor. But of course, the big difference is that the whole point of a joke is always completely destroyed if you have to explain it. Whereas the whole point of philosophy is that you try and get things explained and said in such a way that they can be understood, and that they can be understood as a result of the explanation and the argument that is behind them. My first answer would be that philosophy is among the things we want for its own sake. We want love, we want music, we want pleasure, we want happiness, and we want, at least some of us want, and I think maybe everybody wants at some level, we want to have some sort of convincing, true view of the world, which is a philosophical ambition. So that's my first answer. My first answer is that the question is misguided because the whole point of philosophy is that it's among those things we want other things for, and not something that we want for other things. Although I would say that the real answer is that you should do philosophy for itself, it's also true that philosophy is actually extremely useful because, especially nowadays when we talk about the economy being a knowledge economy, it's not so much a knowledge economy as an economy that depends on the power of thinking. We should certainly ask the question, what is thinking? And the answer is not simple, because there is perhaps a tendency, and I think that philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century, when he talked about thinking and when he defined human beings as thinking things, I think he had in mind the capacity for consciousness as well as the capacity for what we would in a narrower sense now call thinking, which is related to reasoning. Now, Descartes thought that animals were able to, perhaps were able to respond to stimuli, but that they didn't really have anything like consciousness, that they were in particular unable to reason. And that we would probably have machines that could do the kinds of things animals do when we just develop clockwork a bit more, but we would never have machines that could think. And the amazing thing is that 4 centuries, almost 4 centuries later, when we actually do have machines, they're still very bad at doing the things that animals can do most easily, like seeing and walking and running. But they're much better than we are at doing a certain kind of thinking. And that kind of thinking is one of two sorts of mental activity that we include, I think, in the most general sense of thinking. It is the analytic kind of thinking, which typically uses language, which is explicit, which proceeds slowly, methodically, one sentence at a time, according to well-defined rules, and in which, since it includes mathematics and scientific knowledge, in which we find the way to get to the moon. Nobody would ever have gotten to the moon by what we call the seat of our pants. And the seat of our pants kind of thinking represents the other kind of thinking, which is much closer to what animals close to us, our cousins, other primates and other mammals, can do. And unlike the analytic, I would call this, many people call this the intuitive type of thinking. It's very fast, it's very easy, we do it effortlessly. It is something that is very efficient, and we do it most of the time because it is so much easier than analytical thinking. So that, in general, that's how we work. But, unfortunately, many of our intuitions in this system of thinking, while they're able to solve immediate practical problems, were not really set up to solve the sorts of problems that the complexity of modern life involves. And so we make a lot of mistakes. We make mistakes in judging probabilities or in inferring probabilities. We make mistakes that issue from a kind of systematic laziness of our minds, which drags us to the intuitive rather than the analytic solution. So let me give you an example that appears in Kahneman's book. This is a wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman did an enormous amount of research in the 70s and 80s and 90s with Amos Tversky on the many ways in which people get wrong the answers to apparently very simple problems. Here's one example that I found particularly striking. There is a statistic that shows that the highest rate of liver cancer is to be found in what are called in the United States red counties. That is to say, counties that are very heavily Republican, right-wing in their political orientation. So some people might say, well, understand these are rural counties where people, drink a lot and they eat and they don't have the benefits of a lot of education, and that's probably why their style of life leads to their having these high rates of liver trouble. But there's also a statistic that shows that the lowest rate of liver trouble is in exactly the same kind of red counties. And if you were just presented with that, you would easily think of an explanation. Well, these are rural counties where people eat the fruit of the land, where they live in a much healthier way than they do in cities. So you see, we're led to invent explanations for this kind of statistics. And it turns out that the real explanation, which nobody thinks of right away, is that the reason that you get both the highest and the lowest rates is that those are small counties. And if you have a small sample, then the variance inside a small sample is much greater than if you have a large sample. And this is an elementary truth of statistics, but it's not the kind of thing that anybody actually thinks about. So the way in which you try to think for an explanation of this relates to things you're used to. and you're not used to thinking in terms of the formalities of statistical theorems which lie behind this simple truth. So that's just one of many, many examples of the way in which, in order to get the answer to certain questions, we have to go to the analytic level, and we are very likely to be misled if we stay with what seems obvious as the answer. Obviously, you can look at examples like that and think, well, so we should be thinking analytically all the time. But the problem is that most of the ordinary problems of life are incredibly hard to solve analytically. For example, I was just reading an article in the New Scientist yesterday that suggests that among the unsolved problems that science has still been baffled by is the very simple question, what makes a bicycle stay up? Now, most of us think, well, how can that be a difficult problem? Well, that's because it's a problem that when you've learned to ride a bicycle, your body solves. And of course, your body means your brain. Your brain is integrating information about the angle between you and the ground, between the angle of when you're turning, and it is adjusting the balance in accordance with these principles. But if somebody were to say, okay, here's the formula. You have to adjust the angle of your handlebars in a way that is related to this formula, which has the angle of the bicycle, the speed of the bicycle, etc., in this formula, of course, you'd be totally unable to do it. Now, that's an example of a physical capacity that we have that is entirely in the realm of the intuitive. But there are many capacities that are more, let's say, closer to the intellectual ones, which are also very efficiently solved by the intuitive system. One good example is something that most people are very good at, but some people, in particular people suffering from autism, are very bad at. And that is figuring out, just by looking, how somebody is feeling and what it means. Now, people who suffer from autism, who are often highly intelligent, and there are many people, autistic people, have written about this, they just need to learn the rules. They need to learn things like, if somebody's mouth corners go up and their eyes sort of twinkle in a certain way, that probably means they're happy. That means they're pleased. Things are going okay. If their eyebrows are furrowed and they sort of narrow their eyes, that means they're not. So they think that, oh, make a note of that. Make note that person is doing this. Check, check. Oh, that probably means. And you see how people actually do very gradually learn to deal with this when they have to learn the rules one by one, but it's enormously difficult. So the reason that most of our life is run on the basis of the intuitive system is simply that the intuitive system has had not only all the years of your learning how to behave as a human being, but it's had the millennia in which our ancestors have had to evolve certain capacities to recognize at a glance the way that other people are feeling and the way in which our social relations are developing in a group. So typically, those would be the things for which you really need the intuitive system to be allowed to function. And a number of researchers, as a Dutch researcher called Dijksterhuis, for example, Dijksterhuis's finding is that if you give people a bunch of descriptions of houses and you ask them to look at those descriptions and decide which is the better deal. Now, the experiment that I'm thinking of involved giving some people just 10 minutes to whiz through a dozen descriptions, giving others 2 hours, and sending the others home and say, look at them over the weekend and come back on Monday and tell us which you think is the best deal. And now, assuming that there was a way of objectively saying what were the best deals, which is an assumption of the experiment, what they found was that the people who looked at them for 10 minutes did better than the people who sweated over the decision over the whole weekend and made up, as indeed the first time I bought a house I did, made up a chart saying, here are all the advantages of this house and the disadvantages of this house versus all the advantages of this house and the disadvantages, and how much I would pay for each advantage and how much I would need to be paid for this disadvantage, and let's all add it up. The people, now that takes a long time, and that's the analytic method. But just sort of look at them as thinking, I like that one. That actually seems, in many cases, to yield better decisions. This is very surprising, counterintuitive, but apparently there is a certain amount of evidence for it. So now that's often raised, the question of whether somebody can be too rational. And I have a cut and dried answer to this, because I think that I can define rationality. This is a very bold claim because, you know, lots of ink has flowed on this question. But I think the simple definition of rationality in general is that it corresponds to the most efficient way of attaining whatever is your goal. Now, the sting, of course, is in the question of what kind of goals are we talking about? If your goal is to believe what is true, then you're looking at the rules of epistemic rationality. That is to say, the kind of rationality and rational reasoning that is most likely to lead you to true beliefs and lead you away from false beliefs. If your goal is to live well, it's a lot more complicated. If your goal is to desire the things that are best to desire, it's also a lot more complicated. But the general point is that when somebody says, oh, so-and-so is too rational, she thinks too much, what they really mean is that that person is more likely to use an analytic approach to solving problems, even when that analytic approach is not a good idea. Because even when it's not the kind of thing that an analytic approach is likely to be most efficient for. So, for example, I don't know, choosing a mate, choosing somebody to marry. It might be that to be over-rational about that is to try and calculate what are the advantages and disadvantages of this potential mate and this other potential mate. And, you know, whether this is a good method or not probably depends on the kind of society in which you live. There was certainly a time when that was the only way to proceed, and it seemed perfectly reasonable. But nowadays, when people have this very strange idea that they have to be in love with someone in order for that person to be their best mate, then I think that most people would say it's being too rational to think about you know, how it would affect our families, our finances, our property, and so on and so forth. So in sum, I would say that the accusation that somebody is too rational, if you really look at it, in the end, it just amounts to saying that they're not rational because they're approaching a problem in the wrong way. So no, I don't think you can ever be too rational. But of course, emotions do both those things. I think any living thing, whether it be a tree or an insect or a person, needs to have a repertoire of responses that will keep it out of trouble long enough to perpetuate its genes. Now, in the case of the simplest organisms, these are generally what are called tropisms. That is to say, they are like reflexes which automatically guide a bacterium, let's say, towards a higher concentration of a certain chemical, or away from or towards a source of light. And those are extremely simple, even though they are complex enough to count as being goal-directed. But now when we get into animals that have a complex social life, like primates and of course especially like human beings, the situations in question get so complicated that no reflexes could ever deal adequately with all those situations. So I think that emotions are actually constructed in the course of our education as children, and then perhaps continued in the course of our education, our self-education, as we read literature, watch movies, think about things. But they're originally created from dispositions to respond in an immediate way, which are then interpreted by a child's environment as constituting a story. And that story is, in fact, an emotion. So you can imagine a child responding in a completely spontaneous way to the loss of her caretaker's attention, to not being attended to. Hey, 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 mommy or daddy, right? You get distress. And then the child sees that the caretaker's attention is directed to someone else. And that begins to look like a story. And in this story, this is called jealousy. And jealousy has this structure that has to do with the way in which the participants relate to one another and the way in which it can be resolved, if it can be resolved. So emotions are complicated, and nevertheless, they arise from dispositions that have arisen in the course of evolution. But they've arisen in the course of evolution in ways that perhaps were effective in dealing with some of the original situations in which they arose, but they're no longer effective now because the situations are very different. And so that's why they're, on the one hand, very efficient in dealing with certain situations. I see somebody frightening, I run away. Somebody insults me, I confront them. These may be very effective ways of dealing with social situations, but they may not be adequate in the more complex environments that we now live in. So I always think of this in terms of McDonald's food. McDonald, if you were to observe children from another planet, you would immediately conclude that McDonald's food is the food that God intended for all humans, because it is the only food that a child of any culture will consume with relish if they're planted into a McDonald's from a culture where the food was totally different. This happened to me with a 4-year-old Chinese boy who had just come from China. I took him to McDonald's and I thought, my God, he won't want to eat anything. This is so unlike the food that he's ever had. No, any child loves McDonald's. Why? Because it is calculated to give you exactly those things which we used to need a few million years ago, but now do not need. Lots of fat, lots of sugar, some protein, and lots of salt. We are built to want those nutrients, but they're not good for us now because we got too much of them. Similarly, our emotional repertoires, insofar as they're built on innate dispositions, our emotional repertoires were extremely efficient in keeping us alive and fertile in our ancestral environment. But many of those emotions are now very counterproductive in modern society. And so you can see that these two sides of emotions are actually, once again, just two sides of the very same thing. Descartes, who, as I know you know, wrote one of the greatest books about emotions in the history of philosophy, put this in a very neat way. He said the great thing about emotions is that they keep you focused on certain ideas which the rapidity of our intellectual faculties might cause us to abandon too fast. So they give us a sort of inertia that is useful to keep you on track. That's what's good about them. But that's also exactly what's bad about them, because sometimes they, out of this kind of inertia, they keep you obsessing on something you ought not to have been obsessing on in the first place, or that you ought to stop obsessing on. And so I think that one of the most interesting things about emotions is that the two sides of emotions, the way in which they're really absolutely good and really absolutely bad, are actually two sides of exactly the same thing about emotion. And of course, the phrase you used, that emotions come to set the problems we have to resolve, is one that we have to remember as fundamental, because if we had no emotions, we would not care about anything. And in a world where no one cared about anything, I cannot imagine how there could be any such thing as good or bad, morality or immorality, right or wrong. All of these things stem from the fact that we care. They stem from our emotions at the rock bottom level. That would be how I see it. I would preface anything that I said about this by saying, perhaps somewhat in a way that perhaps lacks respect for some of my colleagues who spend their lives trying to figure out the foundations of morality, I would want to say that no attempt to ground morality has ever succeeded. Neither the attempts that were based on the idea that God's commands are the source of morality, nor the very sophisticated ideas of Immanuel Kant that tell us that morality can be discovered by sheer reason. And in between those, or perhaps on one side of one or the other, the consequentialist views of people like Peter Singer, that tell us that we just have to look at the sum of pleasure and pain. Now, I think there's a lot more to that than to the others, but in the end, none of them really succeeds in accounting for all our moral intuitions. And I don't think anything is going to account for all our moral intuitions. I think that our emotional response to both principles and specific cases, which we judge in one way or another, those emotional responses are, in the end, all we have to go on. And of course, that sounds like a big circle, because it sounds like I'm justifying my emotions by appealing to my emotions. But that's not necessarily the case, because I can have emotions at the meta level, second order emotions. I can have emotional responses to the very fact that I have an emotional response. I can say to myself, I approve, I feel good about having that emotional response, or I feel bad about having that emotional response. And I think that that is a hugely important instrument of moral progress. Because, actually, when I say hugely important, it's the only real instrument that we have. Confronting our emotions at different levels with one another, and trying to arrive at what, in a famous phrase coined by John Rawls, is a reflective equilibrium. And the phrase reflective equilibrium, of course, signals that it's not just a battle of feelings. Reflection has everything to do with thinking. So a reflective equilibrium must be achieved by thinking about those things, arguing about those things, and when we do this, we not only clarify what we really care about, but we actually come to care about radically new things. And we come to disagree with others and with ourselves on the basis of this. And so what results from the idea of explicit reflection, typically conducted in language, with language, is not just a clarification of values, but the actual creation of a multiplicity of values, not all of which are mutually compatible.